Well, good morning and welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is a ongoing presentation by the IPAF North American Regional Council, our educational series that we have six of each year. And today's webinar will be on the topic of what is compliant MEWP operator training. And today I'm pleased to have a co-presenter with me today, James Ronduen from Sunbelt Rental. He's their National Safety Training, Technical Safety Training Manager. I'm Tony Groat. I'm IPAF's North America Regional Manager. In today's presentation, I will tell you that having been in the industry for lots of years, we often hear complaints of some, I'm going to say, inferior or non-compliant training that's taken place in the marketplace. As an individual who sits as a chairman for ANSI standards, I get calls, from individuals saying, "Hey, this training out here, people are doing it, and they're doing it in under an hour, and they're saying that it's compliant training, and what are you going to do about it?" And ANSI doesn't have any enforcement powers. They're voluntary consensus standards, but we know that some of the things that are out in the marketplace may fall short of what those standards are, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what are the requirements, what are the uh, parameters that our industry identifies as being compliant training. So within the OSHA regulations and the construction standards, which is the 1926 regulations, there's a requirement for employers to instruct employees in the recognition and avoidance of unsafe conditions. And the regulations applicable to its work environment. So it really is about having a safe workplace, which is the fundamental requirements within the OSHA regulations as a whole. And then specific to the operator of the equipment, it also requires that only authorized persons shall operate an aerial work platform. So within the context of what is the requirements for operator training within the OSHA regulations, I would say it's pretty limited within the scope of, if someone says, "I'm training to the OSHA regulations," I would be uh, struggling myself to say, well, what is that? What is the content of that training, and what is it that you're trying to provide? All right, now I'm having a difficult time moving my slide. Let me see. Ah,
Yeah, that's right, Tony. And, after the OSHA standards we talk about, we get a little bit more guidance through the industry standards. So, what the MEWP industry standards are, ANSI A92.22, that one's going to refer to the specific requirements for how to the application, the inspection, that training requirement that we're going to dive more into, and then maintenance, repair, safe operations of that mobile elevated work platform, which we simply refer to as MEWPs nowadays. And then that ANSI A92.24 provides the methods and guidance for preparing and delivering proper MEWP training and familiarization. Anything else you would add to that, Tony, or are we good to move on?
yeah, I mean, my own sense is that the most significant thing that occurred, which was in 2018, when the ANSI standards actually developed a training standard. So prior to this, we used to have a training for individual products, and within there, we defined training requirements. But now the training standard provides some very specific details that we'll actually get into more detail as we go through our presentation today.
I agree. It's helped us out a lot.
So one of the frameworks that we have and that we'll talk about a little bit today that I want to go over is some of the definitions within the ANSI standards. And the first one is training. And training are the instructions to enable the trainee to become a qualified person regarding the tasks to be performed, including knowledge regarding potential hazards. The key uh, term within that definition is the word enable. So training enables you to become qualified. Training does not make you qualified. So you really need to understand that when you have someone who goes through training, it doesn't, by completion of that, make them qualified for a task. Then we end up having a term that's is retraining, and retraining, by definition, is the required instructions based on the user, the employer observations and evaluations to maintain a previously trained person's status as a qualified operator. So within the scope of that, we'll get into the details of what retraining, what constitutes a point that retraining would take place. But understand that it is the instructions based on the user's observations. So it's not going to a training center or training company to get this retraining. It really is the information from that user and the instructions to bring them up to speed. And then the qualified person, which is a term that we use often for all, I'm going to say, entities who are involved in the process. The qualified person is a definition that OSHA uses, that we use within our standards, which is a person who, by possession of a recognized degree, certificate, or professional standing, or by extensive knowledge, training, and experience, has successfully demonstrated his or her ability to solve or resolve problems related to the subject matter and the work of the project. So a qualified person has some latitude. So it's not like just because they went through training, they're qualified. So again, has successfully demonstrated their ability to solve or resolve problems is a real hook to that definition. That means that just because you have a degree doesn't make you necessarily qualified to do these other tasks. And then we end up having a trainer, and that's a person who's qualified to conduct the training. So when you're looking at these definitions and you're going over and saying, who is a trainer? Again, a trainer is a qualified person, and you go up to that definition up above, who can conduct that training. And last but not least, we introduced in 2018 this term for a supervisor. And a supervisor is an entity assigned by the user, by the employer, to monitor the operator's performance and supervise the work. So ultimately, all operators have somebody who oversees them, and that person is their supervisor. And we have defined some accountabilities that are part of the user, the employer's responsibilities, but it's done by this particular person.
Yeah, Tony, and a little bit more information around that training standard and some information that states is that only personnel who have received the training that you were talking about that's in compliance with the standard. So it meets all of the requirements, and we'll get a little bit more into what that includes. But everything that is required under the inspection, the application, operation of the MEWP, and that also includes those hazardous areas or recognition of those hazards and how to avoid them. These are the only individuals that should be authorized or shall be authorized to operate that MEWP. So shall being that mandatory word, and then we'll get more into that authorization piece.
Yeah, and the one thing that I always like to point out here is too often people say, all right, I want to have a guy who's trained to be an operator, which means I need to make sure it knows how to go up and go down and go left and go right. And it's not just about the motion of that machine. When you're looking at it, it's regarding the inspection, the application of the equipment. Is it the right machine for the application, the operation of it? And again, recognition and avoidance of hazards associated with their operation. So there's much more in there than just saying, get on that machine and let me show you the controls. And now you know how to make it go up. You know how to make it go down. You know how to drive it forward and reverse. Okay, that's all there is to it. And there's a lot more to it.
There is.
And so within the scope of that, when we're looking at what are the operator's responsibilities, what are we really training them to do? So one is they need to know that they need to be trained, and training is kind of like getting your driver's license is the analogy that I give. And they need to be familiarized on any specific model machine they're going to get on. And familiarization in that analogy is I go and I rent a car and I pull out and I don't even know how to turn the windshield wipers on. I don't know where the control is for that. Or how do I turn the lights on onto this car? And so when you pull out and it's dark out and you aren't familiarized with it, you can see even though you're a trained operator, you may have some hazards and risk over here because you're not familiarized with the machine that you're on. So an operator needs to know that I'm going to be trained, and you need to be trained on each classification of machine that you're on. So if you were trained on how to operate a scissor lift, it doesn't mean that you were trained on how to drive a self-propelled boom or a towable boom or other categories of equipment. So they need to be aware of what they're able to do and not do through their training. So they be trained on the type of equipment, categories of equipment. They need to be familiarized afterwards on every machine they're going on. And then last but not least, they need to be authorized to operate that machine. And we go through all of these details within that training. So they need to know how to operate the machine quickly. And we're going to go through some of the content in there that you'll see kind of the scope of this. Well, what does it mean how to operate it safely? I know how to make it move up and down. But what are some of those things that are over there? They need to know how to perform a daily pre-start inspection. So every day before they get on, they need to do a visual and function test of that machine to make sure that before they start operating on it, the machine is safe to use. And then part of this being aware of the hazards out in the workplace, they need to be aware that they have to perform a daily workplace inspection, daily and during use. So as you can imagine, the job site can change when you're coming over. You look at the scope of a job going from breaking ground to it being fully completed. There's a lot of change in that environment. And when you put someone out on that job site, the job site can change, the workplace can change, hazards can be introduced that weren't there the day before or even an hour before. So they need to make sure that they know that they need to do these ongoing workplace inspections. So think about all this when we're talking about what does it mean to be a trained operator. They need to be able to perform these things. New in our requirements since 2018 is the operator needs to offer occupant instructions. So when someone else gets into that work platform, if they get into it and it's a boom type lift where we have a requirement for wearing personal fall protection and connected to a specific anchorage over there, they need to give this person who's getting into there the information so they can safely work within that environment. And it keeps obviously the operator as well safe by having someone in there who's complying with all of those safe operations. And then last but not least, they need to comply with all of the industry standards, manufacturer recommendations, and site requirements. So all of those elements are part of this knowledge base that an operator needs to have. And that comes through this training, being aware of all of these particular elements and having the skills and proficiency to implement those when they're out on the job sites.
And Tony, that training that they've got to receive, it's got to include two parts. So it can't just be one of these. It's the theory training. So that theory can be done through instructor led, live classroom, somebody giving them feedback, and virtual is also an option that's becoming a real good access point for our customers. But then we can also do that online component also. So instructor led or online followed up by, after the theory, it's got to be followed up by that practical hands-on training and evaluation. So that time for them to spend on the equipment to get familiar with the controls, familiar with its layout, put the hands on and test what they learned in class to do that training and practice outside, followed up by that evaluation by that trainer.
And the only thing I would add to that, Red, is the fact that sequentially they must complete the theory training prior to the practical.
Yeah, it can't be backwards. We can't do it backwards. You got to have that first component followed up by that second.
And really within the practical, it's really testing them on the application of that theory knowledge that is part of it.
It does go with that. That theory knowledge does use a test though, so a written test after the theory. So that's the theory assessment, and then the practical hands-on is how do they apply it? How do they show what they can do? and practice it and then show it. I'm really a stickler on including the training before evaluation though. Give them some time on the piece of equipment to practice and do what we talked about in class. And if you can incorporate any of that into your theory and have that hands-on piece, it's going to help you during that outside training or that hands-on evaluation as well.
So when we're looking at the training and we go out there and just said everybody, oh, okay, I've gone the training, I've done the training that's out there, and we end up in this particular case have very specific requirements within our standards of what the content is required to be within that theory training. So when I hear people going around and saying, "Oh, I was trained in 20 minutes," or "It took me the," I will tell you it'll take you that long to just read the standard and the requirements within it, let alone understand them and have the information to really garner this, that you can retain it for a long period of time. So while this list that we have in front of you is not something that I intend to read line by line with you, it really is kind of giving you kind of the depth and breadth of what is required in that theory training. So if you are delivering this training or you're attending the training, you need to ensure, because when you're an employer, as an example, and you're going to send someone to be trained properly, you need to ensure that they are getting the training that complies with these requirements. So,
Yeah.
the fact that, well, hey, look, we're in a small company and Joe's been an operator for lots of years, and let me go have him train them. And I get to the point where, well, Joe's really been trained on how to operate. Joe's experience is operating the equipment. Does he know all of the details over there? And he may know through his experience a lot of these things, but he may not be aware of all of these things. And again, when I look at equipment that was manufactured in the 1970s when they first came out to the equipment that you see in the field today, believe me, the guy who got on that equipment and would get onto a piece of equipment today may find these machines operating significantly differently. There's lots of other elements that are on these piece of equipment, like load sensing and secondary guarding and all these other types of devices that are on the equipment. So when you're looking at this, it's the selection of the equipment, the purpose of all the controls and manuals. And again, the one thing that I kind of try to reinforce on an ongoing basis, and hopefully we'll hit this a little bit further, is the operator's manual are the things that really segregate and are specific to that particular machine that you're on. So the standards can't go over there and put all the details in there for safe operation of every machine that's in the market or that will ever be designed and manufactured. So this is kind of this general knowledge that you need to have, and the specific knowledge will come from the use and referencing of the operator's manual on these machines. So again, here you can just see the content and the depth and breadth of the information that is required to be within that theory course, which is delivered by either an instructor or through an online curriculum.
Exactly. Yeah, and after that theory, like we said, followed by the theory, then comes the practical content. So this is under the, observation and evaluation of that qualified trainer that you gave the definition on. And that operator needs that time to be able to demonstrate for a sufficient period of time their proficiency. And there's some items that are outlined within the standard that it falls around. And that is the familiarization of the MEWP, including the identification of the functions and their major, how they operate or what they do. And then also the pre-start inspection we talked about before use, pre-start inspection of all of the functions, controls, and everything. Then it falls into that workplace that you talked about, Tony, that workplace inspection. This includes the route of travel to get to the task zone and the task zone. And if there's going to be any changes in the route of travel, it's continuous throughout that evaluation. Also, the setup of the MEWP, traveling from where you started to the setup to be able to take care of the task and the operation and function of all controls. So it's not just what's being used for that task. They've got to be able to demonstrate competency on all the controls, lower and upper, and including the parking and shutdown, I call it, or securement. Now, on the right, you've got a really good example, and we've got something similar to that we use at Sunbelt too. But the number of tasks that need to be set up need to be sufficient to give you that sufficient period of time. Have they been able to demonstrate the elevation, the lowering, the slewing, the travel on, forward and backwards, turns, anything like that, and be able to give them enough time to demonstrate that? But it's also got to encompass what's in that practical evaluation form. What are all those components that are outlined that we say we are going to do that meet the standard to allow that operator the ability of sufficient time to provide proficiency or prove proficiency. What do you got on that testing and documentation that goes with this that I just talked about, Tony, as far as those points that need to be hit?
Well, I'm going to hit those on the next slide. So for me, some of the important elements that are in here is under the direction of a qualified person. So it's direction and evaluation. And then the next thing, shall operate it for a sufficient period of time. And again, from a standard perspective, it's going whatever amount of time sufficient to do all these things is how long it should take. And so when you're looking at that, what is a sufficient period of time? You as the instructor, you as the trainer, when you're developing this curriculum or implementing this curriculum, you need to ensure that all these things are in place. So one of the first things I look at is saying this is the first time that the operator is going to technically be on a piece of equipment. And when you're looking at this, one of the things that you have is that is an operating area. So what are the hazards in the area where this training is taking place? So an instructor should be doing a risk assessment of the site, should be identifying the hazards in that area. So if you're doing it in a rental yard, as an example, you could have forklifts coming in, trucks coming in around, pedestrian traffic moving around there. And how do you protect against those in that environment? Those people and that equipment from what you're doing and you from all of those things. So that you set up this parameter, and that starts this workplace inspection. And when you're doing this, while you can set it up that way, in terms of saying the guy's going to go out on the job site the next day, you should be asking them these questions. What are some of the hazards in this area? Have we addressed those all? Why do we have, if you've coned off the area, you'd be asking, why are we coning off the area? What are the hazards in this area? So it's trying to make sure that they're fluent. And the next day when they leave you as the instructor, they can replicate the evaluation of that work site to ensure that they're safe. So when you're looking at this, and this is really what Red was referring to, is within our standard, we end up having this language in these documents. So again, it goes over and it states that, to demonstrate competency, and again, and we have this one word, competency, each trainee shall show proficiency in both theory, classroom online knowledge, and practical. The results of these shall be documented. So if you're going to go through training, the documentation is that you need to identify in both the theory knowledge and practical in some documented form through this training program that they are proficient. And I'm going to tell you that that's a really critical thing to understand. Well, what is that proficiency I'm looking to identify with the theory knowledge? And what is that proficiency I'm looking to identify with the practical knowledge? Because ultimately, when we talk about this later on, you need to ensure their continued proficiency when you're evaluating them. So you need to know what that criteria is. And within the standards, these forms, which are non-mandatory, they're there for reference, but I will tell you that you better be looking at these things, because if they're in there for reference and you're doing something and you are missing some of these components, you better have a good reason why you are missing them from your evaluations. And here you have the examples for uh, knowledge and for practical. So you're looking at these two elements over here: public safety, regulations, uh, technology, characteristics, safety. And then on the opposing side, you're looking at verification of all these elements that are part of the practical. So these give you some real good sense of, if I'm going to be sending someone to a training class, or I'm going to be going to a training class, or I'm going to be developing a training class, these are some of the tools that are within the standard that you should be looking at and identifying that these things should be incorporated into the training that is being delivered or provided to your individuals. So this gives you this context of what is compliant training. These are elements that you should be saying, check, these are in there, or check, or an X, and these are omitted. So this is kind of the context of what is compliant training based on what our standards are directing uh, you to follow.
Tony, this one you were going to go ahead and cover, and I was going to cover the next.
Thank you. Okay. So within the scope of the training standard itself, so it's going over there. We talked about, here's the curriculum and here's the deliverability. It's going over and saying, what are the elements within a training standard to deliver training? So first, you need to have a qualified trainer. Then when you're looking at that, you need to make sure that you have the proper curriculum. And we talked about the curriculum for both the theory knowledge and for the hands-on practicals. We need to do testing for both of those. We kind of given you some guidelines of, these are some of the elements that they referenced in those documents that are elements that should be thought of when you're performing your test on these people to, I'm going to say, measure their proficiency. When you're going to do the training, both classroom and the practical, you need to have an acceptable training environment. And what does that mean? Well, that means that, I used to remember being on job site office trailers and trying to do some training within there, and there's all this noise around there and people coming in and out, and you couldn't hear anything. And in the lighting, I used to have, the overhead presentations, and you couldn't really see them because it was whitewashed because it was too bright in there. And that was not a really great environment for, I'm going to say, theory knowledge training. Too many distractions, so it didn't support adult learning. And then on the outside, what is the acceptable environment for doing the practicals? And again, we talked about doing a risk assessment on the job site. The same way it is when you go out to work the day after training takes place, a risk assessment should take place in that environment to identify, do I have the right equipment for it? Do I have the proper means to travel in and out? What is my access to it? So there's all of these elements that are part of it that are defined within the safe use standards that you apply in training, that is replicating what you will do the next day out in the field. So having the appropriate environment is really critical to training as well, because what you are doing as an instructor within that training is you are giving them the best example in the most controlled environment that operator will probably have when he's using this equipment. And if you go over there and you, I'm going to say, take shortcuts, what are you training them? It's okay to take shortcuts, and that's what they'll do on the job. You need to be as disciplined as possible in showing them all of the most appropriate things, because you have the most controlled environment that he's going to ever have. And that environment needs to be replicated. Those processes and procedures need to be replicated. They need to be in place each and every time that they're operating that equipment. So having the acceptable environment applies to that training environment as a replication of what they should be looking for out in the field when they're using the equipment. And last but not least is the documentation of all the training, which is you need to give them a certificate of completion. There's information that's beyond there, who's trained them, the date they train them, what is the categories of equipment they're trained on. So the standards actually give those elements. And there's actually, and I didn't pop it up there, but kind of a little sample card of the information that must be provided. So documentation is part of that. So that's part of what we have now put in place with a training standard that incorporates all these elements, not just here's the curriculum and of what needs to be trained. It's how do you deliver this training? And that's all of these elements that anyone who's delivering or providing the training must ensure is in place.
Yeah, and you touched on this before already on the familiarization, but these pictures kind of get us thinking about if there's a type of equipment that's within that classification that we've trained the operator on, but there's a different safety function or a feature or a different, hazard because it's a different make and model, familiarization helps with how that piece is different or the increased difficulty of understanding its operation. Some great examples there with the, slope adjustment and access, egress, or any of these different types of equipment within that type and group classification they were trained on. The thing I like to emphasize on this too is that familiarization has to have, again, that sufficient period of time to spend on the equipment, learning the controls, operating the controls, and demonstrating they're familiar with it. Would you say anything different than that, Tony? I mean, it's not full training, but there still needs to be time in operating these to familiarize themselves.
In fact, in our most recent standard, they actually have language in there after familiarization. The operator shall be given sufficient period of time to become fluent with the machine. So,
Exactly.
it is if you think about it and you look at the scope, and we train on a category. So again, we train you on a 40-foot stick boom lift in your training class, and now you're trained on all 3B categories, which is self-propelled booms. And then the next day you go up and you're looking at some of the things you have here, where we have track mounted machines, we have devices that when you're looking at the controls, it's all of a sudden it's like, wow, this looks much different than the machine that I was on yesterday. Then you take straight mass boom versus an articulated boom. So there's lots of these variables that are out there, and just saying, well, you were trained on this, and I walked you around it and showed you how to machine. Here's all the controls on the machine. You should know how to use this thing. And again, the one thing that I would say, having been involved with this training portion for lots of years, there's a difference that everyone recognizes between an apprentice and a journeyman. And I don't care if that's an attorney who just graduated from college and an attorney who's been practicing for multiple years in the field. There's a difference between what that journeyman attorney, if I had a case where I had to go out there and I was possibly out there with just going out there and walking across the street and saying I got a ticket for that because I didn't go in the crosswalks, versus I'm out there being accused of murder. That's kind of give you a sense of kind of that evaluation of what is their qualification, what are they qualified to do and not do. So again, all of these elements get to the point where somebody who was operating a 40 or 60-foot boom lift, and the next day you go out there and try to put them on a machine that can drive at 180 or 200 foot plus in the air.
Big
We
difference.
us older guys go over and say, we know what white knuckles means, which is, I can't let go of the controls to actually move them. Because I'm petrified. So again, there's a big difference between those two, and we hear it when we're out there doing training. And you need to be listening for it when you're out there in the field, assigning someone, even though they've been trained, even though they've been familiarized, are they qualified to perform this task?
Yeah, exactly. And that leads to your next slide. No, actually, next one is qualified. Yeah, this is it.
So this is the key. And again, I go back to that definition of training. Training enables one to become qualified. It doesn't make them qualified. So part of the requirement within the scope of the standards is the user shall ensure that their personnel are trained, qualified, and authorized to these training requirements. So within the scope of it, again, training is a component that can build on their ability to become qualified. And it may be a big part of it, or it may not be as big a part of it based on what the tasks are. You can have a very complex job site. If I'm out there in an auditorium going up, 15, 20 feet in the air to change a light bulb, my skill level may be less than required for a job site where I'm out and I'm going 80 feet and I have to extend in between steel to reach the job. And, the complexity of the task, even though it incorporates being an operator of a MEWP, can go over and just saying, are they qualified for the task? And then have trained and qualified supervisors. So again, I keep going over and just saying, I have someone who was trained, and is he qualified? So again, monitoring and performing this ongoing assurance, they are compliant with the provisions of the standards. Think about, I always go back to the, am I smarter than the fifth grader? Uh, there's lots of things that we all took in class when we were in fifth grade, but years later, if we haven't used it, we lose it. And that's part of what also occurs here. There's an awful lot of knowledge and requirements that are part of being proficient at these operations. And so you need to make sure that you're out there observing them and making sure that they're qualified. And again, the user has the ultimate responsibility to assess that the personnel are qualified to perform the task. And that is, again, getting trained, getting familiarized, and then watching them on the job site and the complexity of the job sites to ensure that they are trained. So again, training is a component of that. It's not the period. It's not, I always say this is a journey. It's not a destination. So the destination is I completed my training, but the journey for being qualified continues on. And these are all components within the standards that bring that to a deeper knowledge about what being qualified is.
And during that um, assessment of them being qualified, if we're watching them on a job periodically and we see any of these examples of improper use or unsafe use, we can't just walk by it because the standard you walk by is a standard that you then accept. There is opportunity for retraining. There is they're not qualified potentially. And we need to inform them on the why this is unsafe. And that could lead to that retraining. I can cover that in the next slide, Tony, if you don't have anything else. I mean, I think these speak for themselves.
Yeah, the critical element that we have here is this supervisor. And again, as Red stated, if you walk by these, you are setting a standard. The standard is this is okay. The standard is for all of these guys, and all of these pictures, no one was injured on. However, we all see that these are unsafe practices and that they are allowed, and they go back to the job site and they get a high five saying, great job, got that job done. Uh, I would say from a critical perspective, I'd go over and say, these weren't a job well done. They were a job done. And you need to make sure that, again, in the overall evaluation, are they qualified to perform the task? having that supervision after they're trained to ensure that they are performing to the level of proficiency that our standards call for are really critical.
Yeah, and if any of those are observed, or a few other, instances we'll cover, retraining is going to come into play. And there's some differences between retraining and renewal. Retraining is required. It is the required instruction by that qualified person to train the operator based on how they were observed or evaluated. And it could be a number of reasons, but can include the lack of proficiency. Maybe that's what they demonstrated, those pictures, or just inability to get to the task zone, or they haven't been operating for an extended period of time. They got their certification, operated years ago, and they haven't operated again. That could deem retraining. Involved in an accident or near miss. I think that one's been in the standards for years, but that is one that isn't always enacted, even after a near miss. An operator is instructed on a significantly new type of task or a significantly new type of equipment, then that retraining would need to be done. And if the evaluation during training, after training, that evaluation deemed that they weren't successful, then that's when that retraining needs to happen. Remedial learning, remedial training, and reevaluation. When it comes to renewal, though, that is that the operator shall again complete the whole training in accordance with the A92.24. Not summarized, it's not retraining. This is the whole piece. And this would happen prior to their expiration of their certification, their operator certification that was completed. So retraining and renewal, there is some differences, but we need to retrain whenever we see that lack of proficiency through the observations.
Yeah, and I would say that I personally dislike the term retraining because it uses the term training, and really can be by anybody who's out there. Toolbox talks are an example. So, you don't need to be a trained instructor to provide toolbox talks. And that's a form of retraining as we define it. And because it's required instructions provided by a qualified person, whoever that qualified person is, doesn't mean that they're a trainer for our operator training as defined in our standards. It can be someone who's qualified to provide, I'm going to say, remedial instructions as opposed to an official training program.
What are
So
those resources that people could go to, Tony? I know that you wanted to get this information out there.
So the resources that are out there within the scope of retraining can be toolbox talks, can be posters, can be lots of information. One of the elements that we have created, and these were first drafted in 2010 to 2012, are these statements of best practices, and we have one that is currently getting close to being released. And this particular is a statement of best practice for training and familiarization for operators, supervisors, and occupants who use mobile elevated work platforms. And these are endorsed by the ARA, AEM, AED, Canadian Rental Association, CRA, IPAF, and the SAIA. And here, subject matter experts get together. And when you're looking at our standards are performance based. So when you're looking at the term that we used earlier, which is they shall operate it for a sufficient period of time. Well, that's a performance based, which is do these things, and whether it takes you an hour or 100 days, the standard doesn't really care. It's performance based. These are the things that need to be done within the scope of going over there and saying, okay, what is operator training and how long should it take? One of the things that's in place is we go over and we can distinguish by giving you here's what we think best practices are, and specifically you're looking at it if you're looking at training versus familiarization. training, which we have the theory classroom training, could take 2 to 4 hours, and the practical, the hands-on, could take 3 to 6 hours, depending upon class size and the number of MEWP classifications that are being covered within that training class. So there's these
Yeah.
variables that are in there, but we can go over there and within these best practices, give you some defined times. So if you're going over there and saying it's going to take at least 2 to 4 hours or 3 to 6 hours for it, you're looking at 2 plus 3 as at the minimum. It's going to take at least 5 hours to go through a training class. In from one of our best practices, it can take 10 hours or more, based on, again, class size and the number of classifications that are in there. So if you're going over there and someone's telling you that they can train you in an hour, we're telling you that our best practices are telling you that in order to cover the curriculum that is within the standards, our best practice is saying that, you're looking at, well over a half a day to do training for these products. And then we take the familiarization, and too often, when we first came over there, when rental companies were dropping the equipment off, and they used to say, "Hey, you need to be so we can train you on this equipment." Well, it's really this familiarization, this term that we have over there. So given to a trained person who's qualified, and that can take anywhere from 15 to 60 minutes to walk around the machine and go over there and provide you with the guidance on the controls and operating characteristics of that machine. So here you can see these best practices, and those best practices will be residing on all of those associations' websites, and they're available for free. You can download them, you can put them on your website. So you have these tools that are out there that are referenced. So I know that the association that I work for, IPAF, we have an abundance of information that's available. I know that rental companies like Sunbelt, that Red represents, have an equal amount of good, viable guidance documents that are on their websites. So there's no end to the information that's available to supplement what your people are doing. So when it comes to this ongoing retraining, there's these tools that are out there that you can reference and refresh everyone on the knowledge that they're required to have as both an operator, a supervisor, you as the employer who has the obligation for the ultimate safety of your employees. So with that in hand, I think we're now coming to the conclusion of our presentation. Red, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add.
No, I just appreciate the time, allowing me to share this time with you and the information with those out in the audience.
So this is a time that if you have any questions, there's a Q&A box that's in place. That if you put those in there, this would be the time for us. We have a few minutes that Red and I can try to address your questions. As a background, uh, uh, IPAF does have a annual event, our Working at Height Conference and Awards. It's October 28th and 29th. 29th is the event. 28th is a networking reception. If you're a member of IPAF, SAIA, CRA, Construction Safety Council, CSC, BPPPA, we are offering you member pricing, IPAF member pricing for this event. So if you go to the log on that you see up there, we are inviting you all to participate and join that. You can register and get your early bird registration for that event. So with that being said, it is now time for Q&A. You have my contact information up in front of you. So if you have thoughts afterwards or questions afterwards, you can do that. And Red, can you see the Q&A button?
I don't think it's on my view.
Okay, it's not on mine. Anna, are you there?
Yeah, I can see it, but no open questions.
Okay, time is running out, team. I know that we're good at what we do in our presentation between Red and I, but if you have any questions or comments, this is the time. Counting down.
Oscar is saying, just want to say thank you for all the information.
Okay. This is a recorded session, so this will be part of the IPAF North America YouTube channel. So if you see value in this, this is available for you to share in that retraining model that we talked about, or you want to share it with anybody else within your organization or with your customers. It has been taped. Uh, and Anna, one last time, any other questions on there?
No questions, but Carmen Givilisco is raising his hand, so I'm gonna allow him to talk. Oh,
Okay.
no. Carmen, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can now.
Okay, I just want to say thank you so much for Tony and Red for all this information. It was great and helpful. And I learned a few more things that I did not know before, and I want to say thank you very much.
All right, Carmine, I appreciate that, buddy.
Thank you.
All right, folks, with no other questions, we will end our session today. Again, we appreciate everyone's joining us today, and hope that we have provided you some information that will be useful for you in the future. Thank you, and that concludes our event.
Thank you all. Be safe.